Chapter 7, Parts 1, 2, and 3 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury, Chapter 7, Parts 1, 2, and 3. Chapter 7. The Perils of Greece, the Persian and Punic Invasions. We have now reached the threshold of the second and the greater Persian invasion, the second and the greater triumph of Hellas. The significance of this passage in their history was not lost upon the Greeks. Their defense of Europe against the barbarians of Asia, the discomfiture of a mighty oriental despot by a league of their free states, the defeat of a vast army and a large fleet by their far smaller forces, these surprises made an enduring impression upon the Greek mind, and were shaped by Greek imagination into a wonderful dramatic story, at a time when the critical instinct had not yet developed. No tale is more delightful than this tale as Herodotus tells it, when we take it simply as a tale, and none illustrates better the story-shaping genius of the Greeks. The historical criticism of it is another matter. We have to seek to extract what actually happened out of the bewildering succession of daring exaggerations, naive anecdotes, fictitious motives, oracles, not to speak of miracles, in most of which the reflected light of later events is visibly altering the truth, while much is colored by the prejudices and the leanings of the Athenians, from whom Herodotus seems to have derived a great part of his record. Section 1. The Preparations and March of Xerxes. The chief event in Persia during the 10 years which elapsed between the first and second invasions of Greece was the death of King Darius. After the unexpected repulse of his forces at Marathon, he had determined to repeat the experiment, and begun to make some preparations. 4 years passed, and then a revolt broke out in the province of Egypt which demanded immediate attention. But its suppression was delayed in consequence of the king's death, and was only accomplished under Xerxes, son of Atossa, who had succeeded to the throne. The question then arose, whether the design of an expedition against Greece, to avenge those who fell at Marathon, and to redeem the fame of Persian arms, should be carried out. It is related that Xerxes was himself undecided, but was over-persuaded by the impetuous counsels of his cousin Mardonius. On the other hand, his uncle Artabanus appears in the pages of Herodotus as the prudent and experienced adviser who weighs all the obstacles and foresees failure. Xerxes, swayed hither and thither between these opposing counsels, is finally determined to yield to the wishes of Mardonius by the peremptory command of a dream, which overcomes even the scruples of Artabanus. In this manner does Herodotus pretend to take us behind the curtain of the council chamber at Susa, representing, in the light of later events, the advice of Mardonius as youthful and foolish, although that advice merely amounted to the execution of the design which, according to Herodotus himself, the old and experienced Darius had initiated and prepared. Nevertheless, the contrast of Mardonius and Artabanus, and the dreams divinely sent with evil purpose, are, though not historical, a most effective dramatic introduction into the episode of the invasion. Further pressure was brought to bear on the king by Greeks who visited his court. Envoys from the Aluid princes of Thessaly, and members of the Pisistratid family, who brought with them the seer Onomacritus to impress Xerxes by favorable oracles. It was clear that the expedition must consist of a joint attack by sea and land. Preparations were begun by the difficult enterprise of digging a canal, about 1.5 miles long, across the isthmus of Mount Athos. On the occasion of the expedition of Mardonius to Thrace and Macedonia, it will be remembered that a large part of the fleet had been wrecked in rounding the dangerous headland. But was it necessary for the fleet to venture on this occasion within the proximity of Cape Athos? Might it not sail straight across the Aegean to Greece? On these grounds Herodotus suggested that the cutting of Athos was undertaken for display rather than from necessity. This is an unsound criticism. It was a fundamental principle of Persian strategy in these expeditions that the army and navy should cooperate and never lose touch. The Thracian expedition of Darius, the Macedonian expedition of Mardonius, the Greek expedition of Xerxes illustrate this principle. The canal of Athos was intended to ensure that the ships should safely accompany the land forces along the coasts of Thrace. It seems to be established that the work was completed and used, though later writers threw doubts on the velification of Athos. When it was finished, the workmen proceeded to lay a bridge over the Strymon for the passage of the army, and preparations were made all along the line of route for the feeding of a vast host. Xerxes came down from Susa to Sardis in the autumn. He met the oriental contingents of his army at Cratella in Cappadocia. At Cannae it is recorded that Pythius, the richest man in the empire, entertained at his own cost the king and the whole army. His wealth amounted to 4,000,000 gold darics. All but 7,000 he kept. Xerxes bestowed upon him 7,000 to make up for the spent sum. Xerxes spent the winter at Sardis. Pythius was so pleased with the king's graciousness that when the army was about to start for the Hellespont in the following spring, he ventured to proffer the request that the eldest of his 5 sons, who were serving in the army, might be permitted to remain behind. Great was the king's wrath at what he regarded as the insolent demand of a slave. The body of the eldest son was cut in two. One half was placed at each side of the gate of Sardis, through which the army was about to march forth. The anecdote illustrates the severity with which military service was enforced. It is impossible to suppose that the whole army wintered in Sardis with the king. It is probable that the place of mustering was at the Hellespont, across which 2 bridges had been constructed in the neighborhood of Sestos and Abydos by Phoenician and Egyptian engineers. But the strength of these bridges was not sufficient, and a tempest destroyed them. The wrath of Xerxes at this catastrophe was violent. He not only beheaded the engineers, but commanded that 300 lashes should be inflicted on the waters of the Hellespont. Those who carried out this strange order addressed the sea as they scourged it in these words: "O bitter water, our Lord lays this punishment upon thee, for having done him wrong who never did wrong to thee. King Xerxes will cross thee, whether thou wilt or not. Just is it that no man sacrifices to thee, for thou art a treacherous and briny river." These words are blamed by Herodotus as un-Greek and impious. The reconstruction of the bridges was trusted to new engineers. 2 lines of ships were moored across the strait by anchors at prow and stern. The line nearer to the Propontis consisted of 360, the other of 314 triremes and pentators mixed. Over each of these lines of ships 6 huge cables, 2 of flax, 4 of papyrus, were stretched, and in 3 places rows were left between the ships and under the cables for small paddling craft to pass between the Euxine and the Aegean. Planks were laid across the cables and kept in their places by a second tier of cables above. On this foundation a road was made with wood and earth, and on each side palisades were set, high enough to prevent the animals which passed over from seeing the water. On a marble throne erected on the shore, Xerxes is said to have witnessed the passage of his army, which began at the first moment of sunrise. The troops crossed under the lash, and the crossing was accomplished in 2 days. But when the size of the Persian host was magnified in later years to the impossible figure of 5 millions, the story was that the crossing of the Hellespont required 7 days and 7 nights, the favorite number of fiction, without a moment's pause. The army was joined by the fleet at Doriscus in Thrace. Fleet and army were henceforth to act together. In the plain of Doriscus, Xerxes reviewed and numbered his forces. What nation of Asia, asks Herodotus, did not Xerxes lead against Hellas? He enumerates 46 peoples, with a picturesque description of their array. The Persians themselves, who were under the command of Otanes, wore coats of mail and trousers. They had wicker shields, large bows, and short spears. The Medes, Scythians, and Hyrcanians were attired in the same way. Then there were the Assyrians with brazen helmets, linen cuirasses, clubs, lances, and short swords; Bactrians with cane bows; trousered Sacae with pointed hats and carrying axes, Indians clad in cotton, Caspians in goatskin, Serangians wearing dyed garments and high boots, Ethiopians clad in lion skins or leopard skins and armed with arrows whose stone points transport us to a primitive age, Sagartians with dagger and lasso, Thracians with fox-skin caps, Colchians with cowskin shields. The fleet was furnished by the Phoenicians, Egyptians, Cypriots, Cilicians, Pamphylians, Lycians, Carians, and subject Greeks. It is said to have consisted of 1,207 warships, with 3,000 smaller vessels. A curious story was told of the numbering of the army. 10,000 men were packed together in a close space. A line was drawn round them, and a wall built. All the infantry passed successively into this enclosure. It was filled 170 times, so that the whole army of fighting men was 1,700,000. The number of the cavalry was 80,000, and there were some additional troops not included. Adding to these the crews of the ships, counting 200 to each larger and 80 to each smaller vessel, the total was obtained of 2,317,000 men. This enormous number was further increased by fresh contingents which joined during the march through Thrace and Macedonia. Besides the fighting men were a vast number of servants, sutlers, and camp followers, whom Herodotus considered to be quite as numerous as the soldiers. The whole host would consequently have reached upwards of 5,000,000, not including eunuchs and concubines. It is needless to say that these numbers are wholly fabulous. The facts which Herodotus states as to the number of the fighting men are false, and the principle of his conjecture that the total number of the host was double that of the fighting men is also fallacious. The picked body of 10,000 troops, called the Immortals, had the privilege of traveling comfortably with their wives and baggage. But this was an exceptional privilege, and it cannot be supposed that the mass of the troops were accompanied by servants. There is reason for supposing that the land forces may have amounted to 300,000, hardly more. A larger force than that would have been unmanageable in a small mountainous country, and the difficulties of provisioning even this were formidable. The number of the fleet must also be considerably reduced, perhaps to 800 triremes. From Doriscus, Xerxes proceeded to Therma with his fabulous host, in 3 divisions, drinking rivers dry in their march. At the crossing of the Strymon, near the place called the Nine Roads, he sacrificed 9 native youths and virgins. At Therma he was rejoined by his fleet, which had been separated from him while it sailed around Sithonia and Pallene. Most of the incidents which Herodotus recounts concerning this march of Xerxes are pleasing stories, designed to illustrate the historian's general view as to the great struggle of Greek and barbarian. The cruelty of Xerxes to Pythias, his barbarity and impiety in scourging the Hellespont, served to characterize the barbarian and the despot. The enormity of the host which rolled over the straits to deluge Europe enhances the danger and the glory of Hellas, and to signify by a solemn portent the destined discomfiture of the Persian host, it is stated that as Xerxes was setting forth from Sardis, the sun was darkened. This eclipse actually happened 2 years later. The tradition which Herodotus follows transposed its date to an impressive and significant occasion. Section 2. Preparations of Greece. In the meantime, Greece was aware of the preparations of the great king for her enslavement, and was making her counter-preparations. The digging at Athos had warned her betimes, and the coming down of the king to Sardis showed that the danger was imminent. Xerxes is said to have dispatched from Sardis heralds to all the Greek states, except Athens and Sparta, to demand earth and water. These 2 cities now joined hands to resist the invasion. They were naturally marked out as the leaders of Greece, in Greece's greatest crisis. Sparta, by virtue of that generally acknowledged headship which we have seen; Athens, by the prestige which she had won in resisting the Mede at Marathon. They jointly convened an Hellenic congress at the Isthmus to consult on the measures to be taken for common resistance to the threatened invasion. We have already observed certain indications of the growth of a pan-Hellenic feeling. But this is the first instance of anything that can be described as deliberate pan-Hellenic policy. It is an attempt to combine all the scattered cities of the Greek world to withstand the power of Persia. It is a new fact in Grecian history, opening scenes and ideas unlike to anything which has gone before, enlarging prodigiously the functions and duties connected with that headship of Greece, which had hitherto been in the hands of Sparta, but which is about to become too comprehensive for her to manage. A large number of cities sent delegates to the congress, which was called the Synedrion of Prubuloi, or Congress of Representatives. It met at the Isthmus, a meeting place marked out by its central position, under the presidency of Sparta. There the states which were represented, 31 in number, bound themselves together in a formal confederation by taking a solemn oath that they would tithe those who uncompelled submitted to the barbarian for the benefit of the Delphic god. This was a way of vowing that they would utterly destroy such traitors. A great many states, the Thessalians, most of the Boeotian states, besides the smaller peoples of northern Greece, Locrians, Malians, Achaeans, Dolopians, and others, took no part in this congress. Their inaction by no means meant that they had made up their minds to Medize. They were only waiting to see how things would turn out, and, considering their geographical position, their policy might be justified by the natural instinct of self-preservation. These northern states would be the first invaded by the Persian, and it was hopeless for them to think of withstanding him alone. Unless they could absolutely rely on Sparta and her confederates to support them in defending the northern frontier of Thessaly, nothing would be left for them but to submit, and with this prospect it would have been imprudent for them to compromise themselves by openly joining the confederacy. Events prove that if they had seriously relied on that confederacy throwing all of its strength into the defense of northern Greece, they would have been cruelly deceived. As we shall see, they were ready to resist so long as there were hopes of support from the stronger states. In some cases there were parties or classes who were favorable to the Persian cause. For example, the oligarchs of Thebes and the Alaudae of Thessaly. One of the great hindrances of joint action was the existence of domestic disputes. There were feuds of old standing between Thessaly and Phocis, Argos and Lacedaemon, Athens and Aegina. The Congress attempted to reconcile such feuds, and Athens and Aegina laid aside their enmity to fight together for Grecian freedom. Another important question concerned the command of the confederate forces. The claim of Sparta to the leadership of the army was at once admitted. The question as to the fleet was not so clear. Sparta was not a naval power, and Athens, which would furnish more ships than any other state, had a fair claim. But the other cities were jealous of Athens. They declared that they would submit only to a Spartan leader. The Athenian representatives, when they saw the feeling of the allies, at once yielded the point. The Congress made some other provisions. While spies were sent to observe the preparations of Xerxes in Asia Minor, envoys were sent forth to various Greek states to enlist new confederates, to win over Argos, who had sent no delegates to the Isthmus, and to obtain promises of assistance from Crete, Corcyra, and Syracuse. None of these embassies led to anything. Gelon, the great tyrant of Syracuse, was himself absorbed by the prospect of an attack of the Carthaginians, and even if he had wished, could have sent no aid to the mother country. When the military preparations for the defense of Greece were made, and the generals appointed, the Congress of Representatives probably met again in spring, and then consigned the conduct of the affairs to the military congresses of the commanders, who used to meet together and decide on each movement under the presidency of the Spartan leaders. King Leonidas was the leader of the confederate army, and Eurybiades, a Spartan, who did not belong to either of the royal families, was commander of the confederate fleet. The Greeks had abundance of time for their preparations, for strengthening their defences and building new ships. Athens probably threw herself with more energy into the work than any other city. One wise measure shows that she had risen to a full apprehension of the truth that a solemn hour in her history had arrived. She recalled those distinguished citizens whom the vote of ostracism had driven into banishment during the last 10 years. Aristides and Xanthippus returned home. Their feuds with Themistocles were buried in the presence of the great danger, and the city seems to have shown its confidence in their patriotism by choosing them as generals. These leaders will each play his part in the coming struggle. Section 3. Battles of Thermopylae and Artemisium. About the time when Xerxes reached the Hellespont, the Thessalians sent a message to the confederacy, suggesting that the pass of Tempe should be defended against the invading army. Accordingly, 10,000 hoplites were sent. But when they arrived at the spot, they found that there were other passes from Macedonia into Thessaly by which the Persians would be more likely to come. There were passes of Wolostana and Petra, which descended into the valley of the river Titaresius, and it was by one of those that Xerxes actually marched. 10,000 hoplites were not enough to defend the three passes, and it seemed useless and dangerous to occupy this advanced post. Hence the defense of Tempe was abandoned, and the troops left Thessaly. This desertion necessarily drove all the northern Greeks between Tempe and Thermopylae to signify their submission to Xerxes by the offering of earth and water. The next feasible point of defense was Thermopylae, a narrow pass between the sea and mountain, separating Thracis from Locris. It was the gate to all eastern Greece south of Mount Oeta. At the eastern and at the western end of the pass, in those days, was extremely narrow, and in the center the Phocians had constructed a wall as a barrier against the Salian incursions. Near the western end was Anthela, the meeting place of the Amphictyotic Council, while on the Locrian side one emerged from the defile near the village of Alpanoi. The retreat of the sea and consequent enlargement of the Malian plain have so altered the appearance of this memorable pass that it is hard to recognize its ancient description. The hot sulphur springs from which it derived its name and the sheer mountain are the two prominent features. It was possible for an active band of men, if they were debarred from proceeding by Thermopylae, to take a rough and steep way over the mountains and so reach the Locrian road at a point east of Alpanoi. It was therefore needful for a general who undertook the defense of Thermopylae to secure this path, lest the detachment should be sent round to surprise him in the rear. The Greeks determined to defend Thermopylae, and Leonidas marched thither at the head of his army. He had about 7,000 men, including 4,000 from Peloponnesus, 1,000 Phocians, 400 Thebans, 700 Thesbians, and Locrians in full force. It is possible that there may have been some other Boeotians who were not mentioned. Of the Peloponnesians, more than half were Arcadians. Mycenae, free at this moment from Argive control, sent 80 men. There were Corinthians and Thessalians, 1,000 Laconians, and 300 Spartans. So far as the Peloponnesians were concerned, this was only a small portion of their forces, and we may suspect that but for Athens they would have abandoned northern Greece entirely and concentrated themselves at once on the defense of the isthmus. But they were dependent on Athens because her fleet was so strong, and they were therefore obliged to consider her interests. To surrender Thermopylae and retire to the isthmus meant the surrender of Attica. But the hearts of the Spartans were really set on the ultimate defense of the isthmus, and not on the protection of the northern states. Their policy was narrow and Peloponnesian. They attempted to cover this selfish and short-sighted policy by the plea that they were hindered from marching forth in full force by the celebration of the Carnean festival, and that the Peloponnesians were delayed by the Olympic games. They alleged that the soldiers of Leonidas were only an advance guard, the rest would soon follow. Yet the feast did not interfere with the movement of the Confederate fleets. As the land arm and the sea arm of the Persian forces always operated together, it was necessary that while the Greek hoplites held the pass under Mount Oeta, the Greek triremes should oppose the Persian fleet in the straits between Euboea and the mainland. The Persians would naturally attempt to sail between Euboea and Magnesia into the Malian Gulf, and thence, accompanying the advance of the army along the western shore of the Long Island to the Euripus. The object of the Greeks was to prevent this, and support the garrison of Thermopylae by controlling the Malian Gulf. The Greek fleet, which numbered 324 triremes and 9 pentaconters, the Athenians contributing 200, chose its station near Artemisium, on the north coast of Euboea. 3 ships were sent forward to reconnoiter on the Thermaic Gulf, and 2 of them were destroyed by the Persians. This was the first collusion in the war. The incident is said to have so depressed the Greeks that the whole squadron sailed back to the Euripus, but this is highly unlikely, for it was bound to remain at the mouth of the Malian Gulf so long as Leonidas held Thermopylae. It was, however, necessary that the Euripus should be guarded, for there was the possibility that the Persians might send round a detachment by the south of the Euboea, and so cut off the retreat. As 53 Athenian ships were absent during the first conflicts at Artemisium, and may be supposed that they were deputed to the service of keeping watch at the Euripus. In the month of July, the Persian army arrived at Thermopylae, and the Persian navy at the Magnesian coast between Casthanæa and Cape Sepias. Their ships were so many that they could not all be moored at the shore, and they had to range themselves in 8 lines parallel to the coast. While they were in this unsafe position, a great storm rose and destroyed, at the lowest computation, 400 ships. Thus the gods intervened to lessen the inequality between the Persian and Greek forces. Encouraged by this disaster, the Greek fleet returned to its station at Artemisium. In this account of Herodotus, the main fact is that the Persians suffered serious losses by a storm off the Magnesian coast. But the loss is exaggerated in proportion to the exaggeration of the original size of the fleet, and the movements of the Greeks are probably misrepresented. The story goes on that, cowed by the numerical superiority of the Persians, even after their losses, the Greek commanders wished to retreat again and were restrained from doing so by Themistocles. The Euboeans were naturally anxious that the fleet should remain where it was, as a protection to themselves, and to secure this they gave Themistocles 30 talents. Of this sum Themistocles distributed 8 in bribes to his colleagues and kept the rest. The facts of this case throw doubt on this story, which was probably suggested by what happened some weeks later at Salamis. For Eurybiadus and the Peloponnesians were bound to stay at Artemisium so long as the land army was at Thermopylae. After the storm, the Persians took up their station at Aphetae. They determined to cut off the Greek retreat, and secretly sent a squadron of 200 vessels to sail round Euboea. The news of this movement was brought to the Greek camp by Scylaeus of Scione, the most remarkable diver of his time, who plunged into the sea at Aphetae, and did not emerge above water until he reached Artemisium at a distance of 10 miles. Herodotus indeed hesitates to accept this tale, and records his private belief that Scylaeus arrived at Artemisium in a boat. The Greeks decided that when midnight had passed they would sail to meet the ships which were sailing to the Euripus, but in the afternoon they attacked the enemy just to see how they fought, and they succeeded in capturing 30 Persian ships. The night was very stormy. The gods had again intervened to aid Greece. The 200 ships, having rounded the southern cape of Euboea, were wrecked off the dangerous coast known as the Hollows. Immediately afterwards, the 53 Attic ships, which had not yet appeared at Artemisium, arrived there, and at the same time came news of the disaster. The Greeks consequently gave up the intention of retreating. There was some further fighting, with loss on both sides, but no decisive advantage, according to the Greek account, but we may suspect that the Persians had the best of it. Meanwhile, Leonidas had taken up his post at Thermopylae, and the Phocians, who knew the ground, had undertaken the defense of the byroad over the mountains. The old Phocian wall in the center of the pass was repaired. It was a serious matter for even such a large army as that which now encamped in the Malian plain to carry the narrow way of Thermopylae against 6,000 determined men. For 4 days Xerxes waited, expecting that they would retreat, awed by the vision of his mighty host. On the 5th he attacked, and in the engagements which took place at the west end of the pass, the Hellenic spearmen affirmed their distinct superiority to the Asiatic archers. On the following day the result was the same. The immortals themselves made no impression on the defenders. Herodotus says that Xerxes sprang thrice from his throne in agony for his army. It was then decided to send round the immortals, hardly the whole 10,000, under their commander Hydarnes, by the mountain road to take the Greeks in the rear. A Malian Greek named Ephialtes guided the band, and so won the name of having betrayed Greece. At dawn they reached the highest point in the path, where the Phocians were posted. The Phocians fled to the heights, and the Persians went on, paying no attention to them. Meanwhile deserters informed Leonidas of the Persian stratagem. He hastily called a council of war. The exact plan of action which was decided on is unknown. We only know that the Spartans, Thebians, and Thespians remained in the pass, while the rest of the Greeks retired southward. It was afterwards represented that they had deserted the defense of the position and returned home. But in that case it was foolish, if splendid, of Leonidas to hold the pass between foes on both sides. The rational courses were either for the whole garrison to abandon the pass, or else, just as the Persians aimed at enclosing the Greeks, so enclose the band of Hydarnes. We may suspect that the second plan was actually adopted. While part of the force, including Leonidas and the Spartans, remained in the pass, the rest, we may suppose, placed themselves at some distance east of the point where the mountain path descended to the road, so as to take Hardanes in the rear. Of the 1,400 who stood in the pass, some had to guard the eastern entrance against Hardanes, others the western against the main army. Leonidas and his 300 undertook the western side, but they were no longer content with merely repelling assaults. They now rushed out upon their enemy. Their charge was effective, but Leonidas himself was slain, and a Homeric battle raged over his body. 2 brothers of Xerxes fell. Many Persians were driven into the sea. But at length the defenders were forced back behind the wall. They drew together on a hillock where they made a last stand, to be surrounded and slain by overwhelming numbers. For the Immortals, having in the meantime routed the Greeks in their rear, had now forced their way into the pass. It was said that 4,000 Greeks fell. The valiant defense of Thermopylae made a deep impression upon Greece, and increased the fame of the Spartans for bravery. It was represented as a forlorn defense, Leonidas and his band devoting themselves to certain death, and clinging to their posts from that sense of military duty which was inculcated by the Spartan system from early youth. The brave Thespians would not desert the Spartans, while the Thebans were represented as detained by Leonidas against their will because they were suspected of secret Medism. The malicious tale adds that, having taken only a perfunctory part in the defense, the Thebans advanced to the enemy and asked for quarter, declaring that they were friends of the great king and had come to Thermopylae against their will. Their lives were spared, but all, including the commander, were forced to suffer the shame of being branded as bad slaves. It is certain that this contrast between the Thespians and Thebans was invented in the light of the subsequent Medism of Thebes. Nor is it clear that the defense of Thermopylae, although eminently heroic, was, until the very end, desperate. If, as we suspected, an effort was made to meet the Immortals, then, if that effort had been more effectual, it might have been possible to hold the pass, and in that case a naval battle must have decided whether the Persians or the Greeks would be forced to retreat. A column was afterwards erected at Sparta with the names of Leonidas and his 300. Among them was to be read the name of Diacones, reputed as the author of the famous mot which displayed the lightheartedness of a Spartan soldier in the hour of peril. When it was observed to him that the Persian host was so enormous that their arrows hid the sun, he replied, "So much the better. We shall fight in the shade." The news of Thermopylae speedily reached the fleet at Artemisium. The Greeks forthwith weighed anchor and sailed through the Euripus to the shores of Attica. End of Chapter 7, Parts 1 through 3. Chapter 7, Part 4, 5, and 6 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 7, Parts 4, 5, and 6. Section 4. Battle of Salamis. Having thus succeeded in breaking through the inner gate of Hellas and slain the king of the leading state, Xerxes continued his way and passed from Locris into Phocis and thence into Boeotia, meeting with no resistance. The Thebans and most of the other Boeotians now, unable to do otherwise, submitted to the Persians. The loss of Thermopylae forced them to this course, as the abandonment of Tempe had forced the Thessalians. In later days, a story was told at Delphi that a Persian band detached itself from the main host in Phocis, in order to proceed to Pytho and plunder the shrine of the god. I think, says Herodotus, that Xerxes knew its treasures better than his own. The Delphins fled up into the heights of Parnassus, leaving only 60 men and the prophet Acaratius in the temple. They did not remove the treasures, for the god said that he would protect his own. As soon as the barbarians approached, marvels began to happen. The prophet saw the sacred arms, which no man might touch, lying in front of the temple, carried out by some mysterious means. And when the Persians came to the shrine of Athena Pronaea, which stood not far from the Castilian fountain, lightning flashed. 2 crags rent from Parnassus fell with a large crash, crushing many of them, and a war whoop was heard from Athena's temple. The barbarians fled in terror, and told how 2 hoplites of superhuman size pursued them. These were Phylacius and Autonaus, the native heroes of Delphi. Such was the legend told at Delphi of the Persian invasion. When the Athenians returned from Artemisium, they found that the main body of the Peloponnesian army was gathered at the isthmus and engaged in building a wall from sea to sea, instead of advancing to the defense of Boeotia, as had been previously arranged. Thus Boeotia and Attica were unprotected. Themistocles and his Athenian colleagues decided to evacuate Athens. They made a proclamation that all citizens should embark in the triremes, and that all who could should convey their families and belongings to places of safety. This was done. The women and children were transported to Troezen, Aegina, and Salamis. The council of Areopagus helped at this crisis by distributing from the treasury of Athena 8 drachmae to each citizen who embarked. At the same time, the great natural strength of the Acropolis, though its walls had been demolished after the expulsion of the tyrants, encouraged the hope that it might be held against the Persians, and a small garrison was left to defend it. This bold and wise policy of embarkation was dictated by the circumstances, but it was supposed to have been based on an oracle which foretold the utter destruction of Attica with the sole exception of a wooden wall. The wooden wall was interpreted to mean the ships, and to suit this view it was represented that the garrison left on the Acropolis was merely a handful of poor citizens who remained behind and barricaded themselves there because they adopted the more literal interpretation of a wooden barricade. This explanation of the oracle was perhaps suggested by subsequent events. While the Athenians were thus showing that they were not bound to their soil, the allied fleet had stationed itself in the Bay of Salamis, and it was reinforced by new contingents, so that it reached the total strength of 378 triremes and 7 pentaconters. The army at the isthmus was now placed under the command of Cleombrotus, brother of Leonidas and guardian of his son Pleistarchus, who was still a child. Xerxes arrived at Athens about the same time that his fleet sailed into the roadstead of Phaleron. He found the town empty but for a small band which had entrenched itself on the Acropolis. Persian troops occupied the lower height of the Areopagus, which is severed from the Acropolis by a broad saddle, and succeeded in setting the wooden barricades on fire by means of burning arrows. The garrison rolled stones down on them, and such is the natural strength of the Acropolis that the siege lasted 2 weeks. Then the Persians managed to ascend on the precipitous north side by the secret path which emerged close to the shrine of Aglaris. The Greeks were slain, the temples plundered and burnt. After the fall of the Acropolis, the Greek generals held a council of war, and it was carried by the votes of the majority that they should retreat to the isthmus and await there the attack of the Persian fleet. The advantage of this seemed to be that they would be in close touch with the land forces and have the Peloponnesus as a retreat in case of defeat, whereas at Salamis they would be entirely cut off. This decision meant the abandonment of Aegina, Salamis, and Megara, and it was strenuously opposed by the Aegintians, Athenians, and Megarians. Themistocles determined to thwart it. He went privately to Eurybiadus and convinced him that it would be much more advantageous to fight in the narrow waters of the Salamian Channel than in the open bay of the Isthmus, where the superior speed and number of the hostile ships would tell. A new council was summoned, at which, it is said, hot words passed between the Athenian and Corinthian general. When Themistocles opened the debate without waiting for the formal introduction of Eurybiades, the Corinthian Adeimantus said, "O Themistocles, those who stand up too soon in the games are whipped." "Yes," was the reply, "but those who start late are not crowned." It is recorded that Themistocles, in order to carry his point, had to threaten that the Athenians, who were half the fleet, would cease to cooperate with their allies and seek new homes in some western land if the retreat to the isthmus were decided. Themistocles won his way, and when it was resolved to fight in Salaminian waters, the heroes of the island, Ajax and Telamon, were invoked, and a ship was sent to Aegina to fetch the other Aeacid heroes. Of all the tales of signs and marvels which befell in those memorable days, none perhaps was more attractive to the Athenians than the experience of two Greek exiles as they walked in the Thriasian plain. One was an Athenian named Decius, and his companion was none other than Demaratus, the Spartan king who had sought refuge at the Persian court. As they went they saw a great dust afar off near Eleusis, such a dust as they thought might be raised by a host of 30,000 men, and then they heard a voice suddenly from the midst of the dust, and it sounded like the cry of the mystic Iacchus, which is cried at the Eleusinian festival. Demaratus asked his companion what it might be. "It is a token," said Decius, "of some great disaster to the king's host; for since the plain is desolate of men, it is clear that the thing which uttereth the cry is divine, and it is a thing coming from Eleusis to help the Athenians. If it turn to the Peloponnese, the peril menaces the army of the land; but if it wend towards the ships, then are the king's ships endangered." "Peace," said Demaratus, "for if these words of thine come to the king's ears thou shalt lose thy head." Then the dust wherein the voice was turned to a cloud, and rising aloft moved towards the Greek fleet at Salamis, and so they knew that the fleet of Xerxes was doomed. Meanwhile the Persians too had deliberated and determined to fight. According to a Halicarnassian story told by Herodotus, the Carian queen Artemisia alone gave sound advice, not to risk a sea fight, but either to wait for the Greek fleet to disperse from want of provisions, or to advance by land into the Peloponnese. The southern entrance to the narrow sound between Salamis and Attica is blocked by the islet of Pistalia and the long promontory which runs out from Salamis towards the mainland. The Greek fleet was anchored close to the town of Salamis, north of this promontory. It would be best for the Greeks if they could lure the Persian fleet to enter the Salaminian Bay so that its flank would be exposed as it sailed through the narrow waters. It would be best for the Persians if they could force the Greeks out into the open sea. Xerxes foresaw the possibility that his enemies might attempt to escape at night, and to prevent this he moved his armament so as to enclose the ingresses of the two straits on either side of Pistalia, and landed troops on that island to rescue Persians and kill Greeks who should happen to swim to its shores in the expected battle. These movements, carried out in the afternoon, alarmed the Greeks. The Peloponnesian commanders brought pressure to bear on Eurybiades. Another council was called, and Themistocles saw that the hard-won result of his previous exertions would now be overthrown. He therefore determined on a bold stroke. Leaving the council, he dispatched a slave named Sicanus to the Persian camp, bearing a message from himself, as a well-wisher to Xerxes, that the Greeks proposed to sail away in the night. If they were prevented from doing so, a Persian victory was certain, owing to the disunion that existed in the Hellenic camp. If the Persians attacked the Greeks here as they were, the Athenians would turn against their allies. This message was believed, and Xerxes took his measures at nightfall to prevent the Greek fleet from escaping by the western straits between Salamis and the Megarid. He sent his 200 Egyptian ships to round the southern promontory of Salamis and place themselves so that they could bar the straits, and he decided to attack in the morning, a fatal decision which only the prospect of the treachery of some of his allies could have induced him to take. The Greek generals, meanwhile, were engaged in hot discussion. Suddenly Themistocles was called out from the council. It was his rival Aristides who had sailed across from Aegina and brought the news that the fleet was surrounded by the enemy. Themistocles bade Aristides inform the generals of what had happened, and the tidings was presently confirmed by a Tenian ship which deserted from the Persians. There is no reason to question the sensational accident that Aristides brought the news, but we need not suppose that this was his first return from ostracism. It seems probable that he had been sent with the ship which fetched the Aeacids from Aegina, and that he was one of the 10 Strategoi. Themistocles had managed that a naval battle should be fought at Salamis, and under the conditions most favorable to the Greeks. The position and tactics of the two armaments have been the subject of much debate. According to the poet Aeschylus, who was an eye-witness of the battle, the Persian ships were drawn up in 3 lines outside the entrance into the sound. The extreme left wing was composed of the Ionian Greeks, while the right towards the Piraeus was the Phoenician squadron on which Xerxes chiefly relied. The Greek fleet was drawn up behind the promontory of Cynosura and facing northward. the Athenians on the left towards the town of Salamis, and the Aeginetans probably near them, and the Lacedaemonians on the right. On the opposite mainland, on shore, under Mount Aigaleos, a high throne was erected, from which Xerxes could survey the battle and watch the conduct of his men. At the break of day the Persians began to advance into the straits. The three lines converted their formation into three columns, and the Phoenicians led the way through the opening between Post-Salamis and the mainland. The Ionians on the left would naturally move through the smaller channel between Post-Salamis and Salamis. When the Phoenicians came into view, the Athenian squadron immediately advanced, assailed them in the flank, and cut them off from the rest of the fleet, driving them towards the Attic shore. The other Persian divisions crowded through the straits, and a furious melee ensued which lasted till nightfall. There was no room for the exercise of tactical skill in the crowded narrow waters, where the fairway between Cynosura and Attica is little more than a mile in breadth. The valor of the Aeginetans was conspicuous. They seemed to have completed the discomfiture of the Phoenicians and to have dispersed the Ionians. The Persians, under the eyes of their king, fought with great bravery, but they were badly generalled, and the place of combat was unfavorable to them. By sunset the great armament of Xerxes was partly destroyed, partly put out of action. Aristides, who with a force of Athenian hoplites was watching events on the shore of Salamis, crossed over to Post-Salamis and killed the barbarians who had been posted there by Xerxes. Among the anecdotes told about this battle, the most famous is that which was current at Halicarnassus, of the signal bravery and no less signal good fortune of the Carian queen Artemisia. She saved herself by the stratagem of attacking and sinking another Carian vessel. Those who stood round Xerxes observed the incident, but supposed the destroyed trireme to be Greek. "Sire," they said, "seest how Artemisia has sunk an enemy's ship?" And Xerxes exclaimed, "My men have become women, my women men." Section 5. Consequences of Salamis. The Greek victory at Salamis was a heavy, perhaps a decisive blow to the naval arm of the Persian power. The wrath of Xerxes against the Phoenicians was boundless. On them he had relied, and to their infidelity he ascribed the loss of the battle. His threats so frightened the remnant of the Phoenician contingent that they deserted. But the prospects of the ultimate success of the invasion were still favorable. The land army had met with no reverse, and was overwhelmingly superior in numbers. The only difficulty was to keep it supplied with provisions, and in this respect the loss of the command of the sea was a serious misfortune. The Greeks represented Xerxes as smitten with wild terror, fleeing back overland to the Hellespont, and hardly drawing breath till he reached Susa. This dramatic glorification of the victory misrepresents the situation. Xerxes was personally in no jeopardy. The real danger lay not in Attica, but in Ionia. The Persians had good reason to fear the effect which the news of the crushing defeat of their navy might have upon the Greeks of Asia, and if Xerxes dreaded anything, he dreaded the revolt which actually came to pass in the following year. It was all important for him to secure his line of retreat, while he had no intention of relinquishing his enterprise of conquering Greece. These considerations explain what happened. The Persian fleet was immediately dispatched to the Hellespont to guard the bridge and the line of retreat. The land forces were placed under the command of Mardonius, who, as the season was now advanced, determined to postpone further operations till the spring and to winter in Thessaly. A force of 60,000 men was detached to accompany Xerxes to the Hellespont. When he arrived there, he found that the bridge had been destroyed by storms, the same storms which had wrecked his ships off Magnesia. The fleet took him across to Abydos, and he proceeded to Sardis, which he made his headquarters. The convoy of 60,000 soldiers returned to the main army in Thessaly, and on their way they laid siege to two towns which afterwards became famous on the Pallene Isthmus, Olynthus and Potidaea. Olynthus, then a Boeotian town, was taken and handed over to the Chalcidians, who remained faithful to Persia. Potidaea successfully withstood a siege of 3 months. Meanwhile the Greeks had failed to follow up their victory. Cleombrotus was about to advance from the isthmus with the purpose of aiming a blow at the retreating columns of the Persian forces before they reached Boeotia. But as he was sacrificing before setting out, 2 hours after noon on the 2nd of October, the sun was totally eclipsed, and this ill omen made him desist from his plan and march back to the Peloponnesus. Themistocles tried to induce the naval commanders to follow up their advantage by sailing after the Persian fleet to the Hellespont, that they might deal it another blow and break down the bridge. It might be expected that, if this were done, the Greeks of Ionia would revolt. But the Peloponnesians would not consent to sail to a distant part of the world, while the isthmus was still threatened by the presence of the Persian army. The story goes that, having failed to get his advice adopted, Themistocles, with that characteristic adroitness which won the admiration of his contemporaries, determined to utilize his failure. The faithful Sicanus was sent to Xerxes, to assure the monarch of the good will of Themistocles, who had dissuaded the Greeks from pursuing the Persian fleet. Themistocles might expect that Xerxes, having been deceived before, would now disbelieve his announcement, and therefore hasten back with all speed to reach the Hellespont, if possible, before the Greeks. But on a later day of his life, when he was in exile, he claimed the Persian gratitude for this service. It was even represented that, with extraordinary long-sightedness or treachery, he had in his view the contingency of being driven to seek Persian help or protection against his countrymen. But the tale need not be seriously criticized. It has all the appearance of an invention suggested by subsequent adventures of the subtle Athenian. The island of Andros and the Euboean city Carystus had furnished contingents to the Persian fleet. Just as the Athenians, after the battle of Marathon, had sailed against Paros and demanded a war contribution, so now the Greeks acted against Andros and Carystus. They failed at Andros, just as Mithridates had failed at Paros. They devastated the territory of Carystus. Great was the rejoicing in Greece over the brilliant victory which was so little hoped for. The generals met at the isthmus to distribute the booty and adjudge rewards. The Aeginetans received the choice lot of the spoil on account of their preeminent bravery, and dedicated in the temple of Delphi, on Apollo's express demand, 3 golden stars set in a mast of bronze. For bravery, the Athenians were adjudged the second place. Prizes were also proposed for individuals who had distinguished themselves for valor or for wisdom. In adjudging the prizes for wisdom, each captain wrote down 2 names in order of merit, and placed his tablet on the altar of Poseidon at Isthmus. The story is that each wrote his own name first, and that of Themistocles second, and consequently there was no prize, for a second could not be given unless a first were also awarded. This ingenious anecdote reflects the reputation for cleverness which had been won by Themistocles. The Corinthians who fell in the battle were buried in Salamis, and their sepulchral stele was inscribed with a simple distich, telling the stranger that Salamis, the isle of Ajax, holds us now, who once dwelled in the city of Corinth between her waters. The stone has been recently found. This is only one of many epitaphs composed by nameless author in those days of joy and sorrow in various parts of Greece, all marked by the simplicity of a great age, whose reserve, as has been said truly, is the pride of strong men under the semblance of modesty. In later days, insensible to such reserve, it became fashion to improve these epitaphs by the addition of boastful verses, which have been imposed till recently upon posterity, and the epitaphs thus disfigured were all said to be the workmanship of the poet Simonides. The exposure of these 2 deceptions increases our admiration for Hellas at the time of the invasion. There were men everywhere capable of writing a simple, appropriate inscription for a grave, and the tombstones of the fallen were not used for superfluous boasts. But the triumph of Hellas had nobler memorials than the unassuming verses of the tombs. The barbarian invasion affected art and literature, and inspired the creation of some of the great works of the world. Men seemed to rise at once to the sense of the high historical importance of their experience. The great poets of the day wrought it into their song. The great plastic arts alluded to it in their sculptures. Phrynichus now had a theme that he could treat without any dread of another fine. Aeschylus, who had himself fought against the Mede, made the tragedy of Xerxes the argument of a drama which still abides the one great historical play dealing with a contemporary event that exists in literature. But the Persian War produced, though not too soon, another and a greater work than the Persians. It inspired the Father of History with the theme of his book, The Contest of Europe with Asia. The theme was afloat in the air that the Trojan War was an earlier act of the same drama, that the warriors of Salamis and Plataea were fighting in the same mews as the heroes who had striven with Hector on the plain of Troy. Men might see, if they cared, this suggestion in the scenes from the two Trojan wars which were wrought by the master sculptors of Aegea to deck the pediments of the temple of Athena, whose Doric columns still stand to remind us that Aegina once upon a time was one of the great states of Greece. And in other temples, friezes and pediments spoke in the conventional language of sculptured legend, by the symbols of lapiths and centaurs, gods and titans, of the struggle of Greek and barbarian. Section 6. Preparations for another campaign. The words of the poet Aeschylus that the defeat of the Persian sea host was the defeat of the land host too were perfectly true for the hour, but only for the hour. The army, compelled after Salamis to retreat to the north, spent the winter in the plains of Thessaly, and was ready for action, though unsupported by a fleet, for the following spring. The liberty of Greece was in greater jeopardy than ever, and the chances were that the success of Salamis could be utterly undone. For in the first place the Greeks, especially the Lacedaemonians and Athenians, found it hard to act together. This had been shown clearly the year before, eminently on the eve of the Salaminian battle. The Peloponnesian interests of the Lacedaemonians rendered them unwilling to meet the enemy in northern Greece, while the northern Greeks, unless they were supported from the Peloponnesus, could not attempt a serious resistance, and were therefore driven to come to terms with the barbarians. And in the second place, if these difficulties were overcome, and a pan-Hellenic force were opposed to the Persians, the chances were adverse to the Greeks, not from the disparity of numbers, but from the deficiency of Greeks in cavalry. In spring Mardonius was joined by Artabazus and the troops who had conducted Xerxes to the Hellespont. The total number of forces now at the disposal of Mardonius is unknown. It may perhaps have been 150,000. Meanwhile the Persian fleet, 400 strong, but without the Phoenician ships, was collected at Samos, with the purpose of guarding Ionia, and a Greek squadron of 110 ships gathered at Aegina under the command of the Spartan king Leotychidus, for the purpose of defending the coasts of Greece, but not intending to assume the offensive. With great difficulty some envoys from Chios induced Leotychidus to advance as far as Delos, but he could not be moved to sail further east with the view to the liberation of Ionia, for Samos seemed as far away as the Pillars of Hercules, and he dreaded the Persian waters teeming with unknown dangers. It seems probable that Athenian policy was working upon the Spartan admiral's inexperience in military affairs. The object of the Athenians was to secure their own land against a second Persian occupation. They therefore desired the protection of the fleet for their coasts. But there was a more important consideration still. If the fleet took the offensive and gained another naval victory, the Peloponnesus would be practically secured against a Persian attack, defended at once by a victorious navy and the fortifications of the Isthmus. The result would be that the Peloponnesians would refuse to take any further part in the defense of northern Greece, and would leave Athens a prey to the army of Mardonius. It was therefore the policy of the Athenians to keep the fleet inactive until the war should have been decided by a battle on land, and for this reason they equipped only a few of their ships. Mardonius, well aware of this fatal division of interests between the Athenians and Peloponnesians, made a politic attempt to withdraw Athens from the Greek League. He sent an honorable ambassador, King Alexander of Macedon himself, with the most generous offers. He undertook to repair all the injuries suffered by Athens from the Persian occupation, to help her gain new territory, and asked only for her alliance as an equal and independent power. In a desolated land, amid the ruins of their city and its temples, knowing well that their allies, indifferent to the fate of Attica, were busy in completing the walls of the Isthmus, the Athenians might be sorely tempted to lend an ear to these seductive overtures. Had they done so, the fate of Peloponnesus would have been sealed, as the Lacedaemonians knew. Accordingly, envoys were sent from Sparta to counteract the negotiations of Alexander, and to offer Athens material help in the privations which she was suffering. Tempting as the proposals of Mardonius sounded, in good reason, as they had to depend little on the cooperation of their allies, the Athenians were constrained by that instinct of freedom which made them a great people to decline the Persian offer. "Tell Mardonius," they said to Alexander, "that the Athenians say, 'So long as the sun moves in its present course, we will never come to terms with Xerxes.'" This answer utters the spirit of Europe in the eternal question between the East and the West, the spirit of the Senate when Hannibal was at the gates of Rome, the spirit of Roman and Goth when they met the riders of Attila on the Catalaunian plain. Thus the embassy of Alexander ought to have strengthened rather than weakened the Greek league. It ought to have made the Lacedaemonians more actively conscious of the importance of Athenian cooperation, and consequently readier to cooperate with Athens. It enabled Athens to exert stronger pressure on the Peloponnesians with a view to the defence of northern Greece, and the Spartan envoys promised that an army should march into Boeotia. But still stronger pressure was needed to overcome the selfish policy of the Peloponnesians. Soon after the embassy of Alexander they had completed the walling of the isthmus, and, feeling secure, they took no thought of fulfilling their promise. The Spartans alleged in excuse the festival of the Hyacinthia, just as before they had pleaded the Carnia. And in the meantime Mardonius had set his army in motion and advanced into Boeotia with the purpose of reoccupying Attica. Once more the Athenians had been cruelly deceived by their allies. Once more they had to leave their land and remove their families and property to the refuge of Salamis. Mardonius reached Athens without burning or harrying. He still hoped to detach the Athenians from the Greek cause. Herein lay his best chance of success. If they would now accept his former offers, he would retreat from their land, leaving it unravaged. But even at this extremity, under the bitter disappointment of the ill faith of their allies, the Athenians rejected the insidious propositions which were laid by an envoy before the council of the 500 at Salamis. Immediately the three northern states which had not yielded to the Mede, Athens, Megara, and Plataea, sent ambassadors to Sparta to insist upon an army marching at once to oppose Mardonius in Attica, a tardy redemption of their promises, with the threat that otherwise there would be nothing for it but to come to terms with the foe. Even now the narrow Peloponnesian policy of the ephors almost betrayed Greece. For 10 days, it is said, they postponed answering the ambassadors, and would have ultimately refused to do anything, but for the intervention of a man of Tegea, named Chelios, who impressively pointed out that the alliance of the Athenian power with the Persians would render the Isthmian fortifications on which the ephors relied absolutely useless. One would have fancied that this was obvious even to an ephor, without a prophet from Tegea to teach him. However it happened, the Lacedaemonian government suddenly changed its policy and dispatched a force of 5,000 Spartans, each attended by some Helots, to northern Greece. Never since, never perhaps before, did so large a body of Spartan citizens take the field at once. They were followed by 5,000 Perioeci, each attended by one Helot. It was clear that Sparta had risen at last to an adequate sense of the jeopardy of the Peloponnesus. The command was entrusted to Pausanias, who was acting as regent for his child cousin Pleistarchus, son of the hero of Thermopylae. At the isthmus the Lacedaemonian army was joined by the troops of the Peloponnesian allies and the contingents from Euboea, Aegina, and western Greece. And in the Megarid they were reinforced by the Megarians, and at Eleusis by Aristides, in command of 8,000 Athenians and 600 Plataeans. It was entirely an army of foot soldiers, and the total number, including light armed troops, may have approached 100,000. The task of leading this host devolved upon Pausanias. The strong fortress of Thebes, which he had abundantly supplied with provisions, was the base of Mardonius, and once the Greek army was in the field, he could not run the risk of having his communications with his base broken off and finding himself shut up in Attica, a land exhausted by the devastation of the preceding autumn. Accordingly he withdrew into Boeotia, having completed the ruin of Athens, and having sent a detachment to make a demonstration in the Megarid. He did not take the direct route to Thebes, but marching northwards to Decalia, and by the north side of Mount Parnes, he reached Tanagra and the plain of Esopus. Marching up this stream westward, he came to the spot where it is crossed by the road from Athens to Thebes, at the point where that road descends from the heights of Cithaeron. The river Esopus was the boundary between the Theban and Plataean territories, and the destruction of Plataea was probably an object of the Persians. But the main purpose of Mardonius in posting himself on the Esopus was that he might fight with Thebes behind him. The Persians had every cause to be sanguine. Not only had they superior, though not overwhelmingly superior forces, but they had a general who was far abler than any commander on the side of the Greeks. Mardonius was not anxious to bring on a battle. He fully realized that his true strategy was to do as little as possible. He knew that the longer the army of the Greeks remained in the field, the more would its cohesion be relaxed through the jealousies and dissensions of the various contingents. We need not take too seriously the story which the Greeks were afterwards fain to believe, that at this moment there was a certain dispiritedness and foreboding of disaster in the Persian camp. An anecdote told by one of the guests at a Theban banquet was thought to illustrate this gloomy mood. Antigonus, a Theban general, made a feast in honor of Mardonius. 100 guests were present, arranged on double couches, a Persian and a Boeotian on each. Thersander of Orchomenus was among the guests, and in after days he told the historian Herodotus that his Persian couchfellows spoke these words to him: "Since we have now shared the same table and wine, I wish to leave thee a memorial of my opinion, that being forewarned thou mayest look to thine own welfare. Seest thou these Persians feasting, and the host which we left encamped by the river? In a little while thou shalt see few of these remaining." The Persian shed tears as he spoke, and Thersander rejoined, "It behooves thee to tell this to Mardonius." But the Persian said, "Stranger, man cannot avert what God hath ordained. No one would believe me. Many of us Persians know it, and follow the army under constraint. No human affliction is worse than this, to know and to be helpless." Mardonius had taken up his position and constructed a fortification on the north bank of the river Asopus, before the Greek army had crossed the Cithaeron. His plan was to act on the defensive. He would wait for the Greeks to attack him, so that the issue might be tried in a plain, when he would be able to reap the full advantage of his superiority in cavalry. It would, on the contrary, be to the interest of the Greeks, when they descended from Cithaeron, if they could by any means entice the enemy to give battle on the rough and high ground south of the river, where the cavalry would be of little use. End of Chapter 7, Parts 4, 5, and 6.
Chapter 7, Parts 7, 8, and 9 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Graham Redman. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnall Bury. Chapter 7, Part 7, Battle of Plataea. The field on which the fate of Greece was decided is bounded on the north by the river Asopus, on the south by Mount Cithaeron. The town of Plataea stood in the southwest of this space, on the most westerly of 6 ridges which connect the lower heights of the mountain with the plain. 3 roads descended here into Boeotia. On the extreme east, the road from Athens to Thebes; in the centre, that from Athens to Plataea; on the west, that from Megara to Plataea. The Greek army took the most easterly way, which, after a gradual ascent on the Attic side, reaches the fortress of Eleuthere and the pass of the Oaks Heads, and then descends steeply into the Boeotian land. They found when they reached the other side that the road passed through the Persian camp, and they were forced to take up a position at the foot of the pass. Their right wing, consisting of the Spartans and Tegeates, rested on the high bastion of the mountain which rises above the town of Erythrae. Their centre on lower ground close to the town, and the left wing, where the Athenians and Megarians were posted, was advanced right down to the foot of the descent. Thus the position of the Greeks was astride the road to Thebes. The only assailable point was the left wing, and against it Mardonius sent cavalry under the command of Mecisteus. Sore bestead by the darts and arrows of the enemy, and with no cavalry to aid them, the Megarians required succour. 300 Athenians, for the Athenians were also on the left wing, went down to the scene of battle, and the fortune of the day was at last changed when the general Mecisteus, a conspicuous figure in the fight, fell from his wounded charger. He was slain with difficulty by a spear which pierced his eye, for his armour was impenetrable, and the Persian horsemen, after a furious and fruitless charge to recover the body of their leader, abandoned the attack. The camp of the Persians was filled with loud wailing and lamentation, echoing, says Herodotus, all over Boeotia, for the death of Mesistius. But this success was far from dealing any solid advantage to the Greeks or serious injury to their foes. The Persians were well content to remain where they were. Their great host still lay north of the Asopus. The Greeks, in order to obtain a better water supply, and knowing that there was no chance that the Persians would attack them in their present position, decided to occupy lower ground in the territory of Plataea. In order to do this, they moved northwestward along the spurs of Cithaeron, past the towns of Erythrae and Hysiae. To understand the operations which ensued, it is to be observed that the region between Cithaeron and the Asopus falls into two parts, separated by a depression in the ground. The southern part is marked by the 6 ridges already mentioned and the streams which divide them, while the northern tract is also hilly, being marked by 3 ridges between which rivulets flow into the Asopus. Westward the depression opens out into flat land, the only flat land here, which stretches northward from Plataea to the river and is traversed by the road to Thebes. The Greek army ultimately arranged itself in order of battle between the Theban road and the Moloais, a tributary stream of the Asopus. Their position was marked by the spring of Gargaphia, which afforded an abundant supply of fresh water, and the temple of the hero Androcrates. We are told that a dispute arose between the Tegeates and the Athenians for the occupation of the west wing, and that the Lacedaemonians decided in favour of the Athenians, who, as we have seen, were under the command of Aristides. The Tegeates were stationed next the Lacedaemonians on the right. Pausanias had now lost control of the eastern passes across Mount Cithaeron. The Persian general, as soon as the Greeks had left their first position, promptly occupied the roads and cut off a provision train which was on its way to supply the Greek army. The Greek general hoped every day that the enemy would attack, but Mardonius, apart from cavalry skirmishing, remained persistently on the defensive. It would seem that the Greeks remained about 2 days inactive in this weak position, harassed by the Persian cavalry, which crossed the river, hovered on the ridges, discharged darts into the camp, and finally succeeded in choking up the waters of the Gargaphia spring. The only course open to the Greeks was to fall back upon the mountain, and either take up a position on the ridges between Hysiae and Plataea, or seek to regain their former position at the foot of the main pass. For they could not venture to cross the Asopus and brave the Persian cavalry. Pausanias held a council of war, and it was determined that the army should fall back to a position between Hysiae and Plataea, and that one division should move up the mountain slope to recover command of the pass from Plataea to Athens. The whole movement was to be carried out at night. Perhaps Pausanias had received information that the Persian commander was growing impatient and was contemplating an attack. In any case, his plan of retreat proved fortunate, and though it was not executed with precision, the Persians, even as at Salamis, were induced to give battle in conditions chosen by their enemy and unfavourable to themselves. We might understand why Mardonius decided to abandon the defensive strategy to which hitherto he had adhered, if we knew something of the intrigues and divisions in the Persian camp. There seems to have been disastrous rivalry between himself and his second in command, Artabazus, who in the ensuing battle did simply nothing, and probably desired that Mardonius should not win the glory of victory. A little to the southeast of Plataea, a spur of Cithaeron was enclosed by the two branches of a stream which met again at the foot of the ridge and went by the name of the Island. It was arranged that the Athenians should now occupy the centre next the Lacedaemonians, and they were instructed to retreat to this ridge. The scheme was carried out as it was planned by the left wing, who took up their post in front of the temple of Hera, which was just outside the walls of Plataea. But the Athenians, for some unexplained reason, failed to obey orders, and remained where they were in a dangerous and isolated position. The Lacedaemonians too seem to have wasted the precious hours of the short night. Their delay is ascribed to the obstinacy of the commander of one of the Spartan divisions, who had not been present at the council of war, and refused to obey the order to retreat. His name was Amompharetus. He was a man of blameless valour, and Pausanias could not persuade himself to leave him behind. But the morning was approaching, and at length Pausanias began his march, convinced that his stubborn captain would follow when he found himself deserted. And so it fell out. When they had moved about 10 stades, the Spartans saw that Amompharetus was coming, and waited for him. But the day had dawned. The Persians had perceived that the Greek position was deserted, and Mardonius decided that now was the moment to attack, when the forces of the enemy were divided. His cavalry came up and prevented the Lacedaemonians from proceeding. It was on the slopes under Hysii, near the modern village of Cricouci, that Pausanias was compelled to turn and withstand the Persian horsemen, who was speedily supported by the main body advancing under Mardonius himself. The Persians threw up a light barricade of their wicker shields, from behind which they discharged innumerable arrows. Under this fire the Greeks hesitated, for the victims were unfavourable. At length Pausanias, looking towards the temple of Hera, invoked the goddess, and after his prayer the prophets obtained good omens from the sacrifices. The Lacedaemonians no longer held back. Along with the Tegeates who were with them, they carried the barricade and pressed the Persians backwards towards the temple of Demeter, which stood on a high acclivity above them. In this direction the battle raged hotly, but the discipline of the best spearmen of Greece approved itself brilliantly, and, when Mardonius fell, the battle was decided. The Lacedaemonians and Tegeates had borne the brunt of the day. At the first attack, Pausanias had dispatched a hasty messenger to the Athenians. As they marched to the scene, they were attacked by the Greeks of the left wing of the enemy's army, who effectually hindered them from marching farther. Meanwhile the tidings had reached the rest of the Greek army at Plataea that a battle was being fought, and that Pausanias was winning it. They hastened to the scene, but the action was practically decided before their arrival. Some of them were cut off on the way by Theban cavalry. The defeated host fled back across the Asopus to their fortified camp. The Greeks pursued and stormed it. The tent of Mardonius was plundered by the men of Tegea, who dedicated in the temple of Athena Alea in their city the brass manger of his horses, while his throne with silver feet and his scimitar were kept by the Athenians on the Acropolis, along with the breastplate of Mesistius, as memorials of the fateful day. The body of Mardonius was respected by Pausanias, but it was mysteriously stolen, and none ever knew the hand that buried it. The slain Greek warriors, among whom was the brave Amompharetus, were buried before the gates of Plataea, and the honour of celebrating their memory by annual sacrifice was assigned to the Plataeans, who also agreed to commemorate the day of the deliverance of Hellas by a feast of freedom every 4 years. Pausanias called the host together, and in the name of the Spartans and all the confederacy guaranteed to Plataea political independence and the inviolability of her town and territory. The hour of triumph for Plataea was an hour of humiliation for Thebes. 10 days after the battle, the army advanced against the chief Boeotian city and demanded the surrender of the leaders of the Medizing party. On a refusal, Pausanias laid siege to the place, but presently the leaders were given up by their own wish, for they calculated on escaping punishment by the influence of bribery. But Pausanias caused them to be executed without trial at Corinth. A Theban poet who sympathized with the national effort of Hellas might well feel distressed in soul. The battle had been won simply and solely by the discipline and prowess of the Spartan hoplites. The plans of the exceptionally able commander, who was matched indeed with a commander abler than himself, were frustrated once and again through the want of unity and cohesion in his army, through the want apparently of tactical skill, most of all perhaps through the half-heartedness of the Athenians. Never do the Athenians appear in such an ill light as in the campaign of Cithaeron, and in no case have they exhibited so strikingly their faculty of refashioning history, in no case so successfully imposed their misrepresentations on the faith of posterity. They had no share in the victory, but they told the whole story afterwards so as to exalt themselves and to disparage the Spartans. They represented the night movements planned by Pausanias as a retreat before an expected attack of the enemy, and they invented an elaborate tale to explain how the attack came to be expected. Mardonius, they said, growing impatient of the delay, called a council of war, and it was decided to abandon defensive tactics and provoke a battle. Then Alexander of Macedon showed at this critical moment that his real sympathies were with Hellas and not with his barbarian allies. He rode down to the outposts of the Athenians, and, shouting, we must suppose, across the river, revealed the decision of the Persian council of war. Thus made aware of the Persian resolve to risk a battle, the Spartans proposed to the Athenians to change wings, in order that the victors of Marathon might fight with the Persians, whose ways of warfare they had already experienced, while the Spartans themselves could deal better with the Boeotians and other Greeks, with whose methods of fighting they were familiar. The proposal was agreed to, and as day dawned the change was being effected. But the enemy perceived it, and immediately began to make a corresponding change in their own array. Seeing their plan frustrated, the Greeks desisted from completing it, and both the adversaries resumed their original positions. Mardonius then sent a message to the Lacedaemonians, complaining that he had been deeply disappointed in them, for though they had the repute of never fleeing or deserting their post, they had now attempted to place the Athenians in the place of danger. He challenged them to stand forth as champions for the whole Greek host, and fight against an equal number of Persians. To this proposal the Spartans made no reply. Then Mardonius began his cavalry operations, which led to the retreat of the Greeks from their second position. The 3 striking incidents of this malicious tale, the night visit of Alexander, the fruitless attempt of the Spartans to shirk the responsibility of their post on the right wing, the challenge of Mardonius, are all improbable in themselves. but nevertheless this story was circulated and believed, and has received a sort of consecration in the pages of Herodotus. End of chapter 7, part 7. Chapter 7, part 8, Battle of Mycale and Capture of Sestos. The Battle of Cithaeron shares with Salamis the dignity of being decisive battles in the world's history. Pindar links them together as the great triumphs of Sparta and Athens respectively, battles wherein the Medes of the bent bows were sore afflicted. Notwithstanding the immense disadvantage of want of cavalry, the Lacedaemonians had turned at Plataea a retreat into a victory. The remarkable feature of the battle was that it was decided by a small part of either army. Sparta and Tegea were the actual victors, and on the Persian side Artabazus, at the head of 40,000 men, had not entered into the action at all. On the death of Mardonius, that general immediately faced about and began without delay the long march back to the Hellespont. Never again was Persia to make a serious attempt against the liberty of European Greece. "A god," said a poet of the day, and the poet was a Theban, "turned away the stone of Tantalus, imminent above our heads." For the following century and a half, the dealings between Greece and Persia will only affect the western fringe of Asia, and then the balance of power will have so completely shifted that Persia will succumb to a Greek conqueror, and Alexander of Macedon will achieve against the Asiatic monarchy what Xerxes failed to achieve against the free states of Europe. One memorial of this victory of Europe over Asia has survived till today. The votive offering which the Greeks sent to Delphi was a tripod of gold set upon a pillar of 3 brazen serpents, with the names of the Greek peoples who offered it inscribed upon the base. The pillar still stands in Byzantium, whither it was transferred after that city had been renamed Constantinople by her second founder. The immense booty which was found in the Persian camp was divided, when portions had been set apart for the gods and for the general who had led the Greeks to victory. The achievement of the Hellenic army under Mount Cithaeron, which rescued Greek Europe from the invader, was followed in a few days by an achievement of the Hellenic fleet, which delivered the Asiatic Greeks from their master. The Greek fleet was still at Delos. We saw that it was the policy of the Athenians to remain inactive at sea until a battle had been fought on land. For a naval victory would probably have meant the retreat of the Spartans from northern Greece, on the calculation that the enemy would not attack Peloponnesus without the co-operation of the fleet. But the armament at Delos was drawn into action by a message from the Samians, seeking to join the Greek League, and begging help against the Persian. For the Persian fleet was at Samos, and hard by at Cape Mycale a large Persian army, including many Ionian troops, was encamped. The Samian request was granted. Leotychidas sailed to the island, and on his approach the Persian ships withdrew to the shelter of Cape Mycale and their army. The Greeks landed, attacked, carried, and burned the enemy's camp. Their victory was decided by the desertion of the Ionians, who won their freedom on this memorable day. Mycale followed so hard upon Plataea that the belief easily arose that the two victories were won on the same afternoon. There is more to be said for the tradition that as the Athenians and their comrades assailed the entrenchments on the shore of Mycale, the tidings of Plataea reached them and heartened them in their work. The Athenians and Ionians led by the admiral Xanthippus, followed up the great victory by vigorous action in the Hellespont, while the Peloponnesians, with Leotychidas, content with what they had achieved, returned home. The difference between the Athenian and the Spartan character, between the cautious policy of Sparta and the imperial instinct of Athens, is here distinctly, and it is not too much to say, momentously expressed. The Lacedaemonians were unwilling to concern themselves further with the Greeks of the eastern and northeastern Aegean. The Athenians were both capable of taking a Pan-Hellenic point of view and moved by the impulse to extend their own influence. The strong fortress of Sestos, which stands by the Straits of Helle, was beleaguered and taken, and with this event Herodotus closes his history of the Persian wars. The independence of the Hellespontine regions was a natural consequence of the victory of Mycale, but its historical significance lies in the fact that it was accomplished under the auspices of Athens. The fall of Sestos is the beginning of that Athenian empire to which Pisistratus and the elder Miltiades had pointed the way. End of Chapter 7, Part 8. Chapter 7, Part 9. Gelon, tyrant of Syracuse. While the eastern Greeks were securing their future development against the Persian foe, and were affirming their possession of the Aegean waters, the western Greeks had been called upon to defend themselves against that Asiatic power which had established itself in the western Mediterranean, and was a constant threat to their existence. The Greeks had indeed, on their side, proved a formidable check and hindrance to the expansion of the dominion and trade of Carthage. The endeavours of this vigorous Phoenician state to secure the queenship of the western seas, from Africa to Gaul, from the coast of Spain to the shores of Italy, depended largely for their success on her close connection and identity of interests with her sister towns in Sicily, and secondly on her alliance with the strong pirate power of Etruria. The friendly Phoenician ports of western Sicily, Motia, Panormus, and Solus, were an indispensable aid for the African city, both for the maintenance of her communications with Tuscany and for the prosecution of designs upon Sardinia and Corsica. In Corsican waters, as well as in Sicily, the Phoenician clashed with the Greek. It was in the first quarter of the 6th century that Dorian adventurers from Cnidus and Rhodes sought to gain a foothold in the barbarian corner of Sicily at the very gates of the Phoenicians. The name of their leader was Pentathlus. He attempted to plant a settlement on Cape Lilybaeum, hard by Motia, a direct menace to the communications between Motia and Carthage. The Phoenicians gathered in arms, and they were supported by their Elymian neighbours. The Greeks were defeated, and Pentathlus was slain. It was not the destiny of Lilybaeum to be the place of a Hellenic city, but long afterwards it was to become illustrious as the site of a Punic stronghold, which would take the place of Motia when Motia herself had been destroyed by a Greek avenger of Pentathlus. After their defeat, the men of Pentathlus, casting about for another dwelling place, betook themselves to the volcanic archipelago off the north coast of Sicily, and founded Lipara in the largest of the islands. This little state was organized on communistic principles. The soil was public property, a certain number of the citizens were set apart to till it for the common use, the rest were employed in keeping watch and ward on the coasts of their little home against the descents of Tuscan rovers. This system was indeed subsequently modified. The land was portioned out in lots, but was redistributed every 20 years. The attempt of Pentathlus, the occupation of the Lipparian group, the recent settlement of Acragas, pressed upon Carthage the need of stemming the Greek advance. Accordingly, we find her sending an army to Sicily. The commander of this expedition, precursor of many a greater, was Malchus, and it is possible that he was opposed by Phalaris, who established a tyranny at Acragas. There was a long war, of which we know nothing except that the invader was successful and Greek territory was lost to the Phoenician. In the northern seas Carthage was also confronted by the Greeks. The Phocians of Massalia planted colonies and won influence on the coast of Spain. We are told that in the days of Cambyses the Phocians gained repeated victories over the Carthaginians by sea. Moreover, the new Phocian settlement at Eulalia in Corsica was a challenge to Carthage in what she regarded as her own domain. But Greek Eulalia was short-lived. Carthage and her powerful Etruscan allies nearly annihilated the Phocian fleet, and the crews which escaped were only able to rescue their families and goods. Eulalia was deserted. Corsica fell under the power of the Etruscans, and the coasts of Sardinia were gradually appropriated by Carthage. Thus the chance of establishing a chain of Greek settlements between Massalia and Sicily was frustrated. It now remained for Carthage to establish and extend Phoenician power in Sicily. We have seen how Dorius, son of a Spartan king, made an attempt to do somewhat the same thing which the Cnidian adventurer had essayed, to gain a footing in Sicily within the Phoenician circle. He, too, failed, but such incidents brought home to Carthage the need of dealing another and a mightier blow at the rival power in Sicily. She was occupied with the conquest of Sardinia and with a Libyan war, and the struggle was postponed. But the hour came at last, and the Carthaginians put forth all their power to annihilate colonial Greece, at the very time when the great king had poured forth the resources of Asia against the mother country. It was, in the first instance, an accident that the two struggles happened at the same moment. The causes which led to the one were independent of the causes which led to the other. But the exact moment chosen by Carthage for her attack upon Sicily was probably determined by the attack of Xerxes upon Greece, and although the two struggles ran each its independent course, there is no reason to question the statement that the courts of Susa and Carthage exchanged messages through the mediation of the Phoenicians, and were conscious of acting in concert against the same enemy. In the second decade of the 5th century, Greek Sicily was dominated by 4 tyrants. Anaxilas of Rhegium had made himself master of Zancli, which from this time forward is known as Messana, and he thus controlled both sides of the straits, which he secured against the passage of Etruscan pirates. Terillus, his father-in-law, was tyrant of Himera. Over against this family group in the north stood another family group in the south, Gelon of Syracuse, and his father-in-law Theron of Acragas. Gelon had been the general of Hippocrates, a tyrant of Gela, who had extended his sway, whether as lord or overlord, over Naxos, Zancli, and other Greek cities, and had aimed at winning Syracuse. Hippocrates had defeated the Syracusans on the banks of the Helorus, and would have seized their city if it had not been for the intervention of Corinth and Corcyra. But Syracuse was forced to cede her dependency Camarina to the victor. Hippocrates died in besieging Hybla, and the men of Gela had no mind to allow his sons to continue their father's tyranny. But Gelon, son of Dinomides, a general who had often led the cavalry of Gela to victory, espoused the cause of his master's heirs, and as soon as he had gained possession of the city, brushed them aside and took the tyranny for himself. The new lord of Gela achieved what his predecessors had vainly striven to accomplish. The Gemorai, or nobles of Syracuse, had been driven out by the commons, and they appealed to Gelon to restore them. The Syracusan people, unable to resist the forces which Gelon brought against them, made terms with him, and he established his power in Syracuse over oligarchs and democrats alike. It seems probable that Gelon was either at once, or at a later stage of his rule, appointed formally general with full powers. We find his brother Hieron, who succeeded to his position, addressed by the poet Bacchylides as general of the Syracusan horsemen. The tyrant of Gela now abandoned his own city and took up his abode in Syracuse, making it the centre of a dominion which embraced the eastern part of the island. Gela had for a short space enjoyed the rank of the first of Sicilian cities. She now surrendered it to Syracuse, which was marked out by its natural site for strength and domination. Gelon may be called the second founder of Syracuse. He joined the island of Ortygia with the fortified height of Acradina, which looked down upon it. In the course of the 6th century, a mole had been constructed connecting the island with the mainland, so that the city, though it was still called the island, had become strictly a peninsula. Gelon built a wall from the Acradina fort down to the shore of the great harbour. Thus Acradina and Ortygia were included within the same circuit of wall. Acradina became part of the city, Ortygia remained the Acropolis. The chief gate of Syracuse was now in the new wall of Gelon, close to the harbour, and near it a new agora was laid out, for the old agora in the island no longer sufficed. Hard by, docks were built, for Syracuse was to become a naval power. She was now by far the greatest Greek city in the west. Gelon, belonging to a proud and noble family, sympathized and most willingly consorted with men of his own class, and looked with little favor on the people, whom he described in a famous phrase as a thankless neighbor. He held court at Syracuse like a king, surrounded by men of noble birth. He tolerated the Syracusan commons. He was not unpopular with them, but he showed elsewhere what his genuine feelings were. One of his first needs was to find inhabitants to fill the spaces of his enlarged town. For this purpose he transplanted men on a large scale from other places of his dominions. His own town, Gela, was sacrificed to the new capital. The half of its citizens were removed to Syracuse. Harder was the fate of luckless Camarina, which was now for the second time blotted out from the number of Greek cities. 2 generations had hardly passed since she had been swept away by the Syracusan republic, and now the Syracusan tyrant carried off all the inhabitants and made them burgesses of the ruling state. Megara, the next-door neighbour of Syracuse on the north, and Euboea higher up the coast, also contributed to swell the population of Gelon's capital. Megara became an outpost of Syracuse, while Euboea was so entirely blotted out that its very site is uncertain. But in both these cases the policy of Gelon strikingly displayed the prejudice of his class. He admitted the nobles of Megara and Euboea to Syracusan citizenship, he sold the mass of the commons in the slave market. In abolishing cities and transplanting populations, Gelon set an example which we shall see followed by later tyrants. He also invited new settlers from elder Greece, and he gave the citizenship to 10,000 mercenary soldiers. Gelon was supported in his princely power by his three brothers, Hieron, Polyzelus, and Thrasybulus. He entered into close friendship with Theron, his fellow tyrant, who made Acragas in wealth a power second only to Syracuse itself. Theron, like Gelon, was a noble belonging to the family of the Eminids, and his rule was said to have been mild and just. Gelon married Damareta, the daughter of Theron, and Theron married a daughter of Polyzelus. The brilliant lords of Syracuse and Acragas, thus joined by close bonds, were presently associated in the glorious work of delivering Greek Sicily from the terrible danger which was about to come against her from overseas. End of chapter 7, part 9. Recording by Graham Redman.